Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The day Daniel laughed at me, the sky over Acacia grew a bruise and held it there, as if the clouds themselves were ashamed to watch. His laughter did not burst. It cut, thin and sharp like the edge of a new razor, sliding between my ribs and finding the quietest parts of me. We had started the evening with plantain on the fire and a silly argument about salt, but small sparks will burn a hut if the wind is right, and our wind had been gathering for months. I had worn patience like a wrapper, tying and readying it as it loosened, but that night the knot slipped. He stood by the doorway with his mouth tilted into a smirk as I folded two blouses and my old blue skirt into a faded handbag. The bulb hummed overhead, and the rain began to drum lightly on the zinc roof, a shy drummer who would soon find a bolder rhythm. "Let's see how far you go with that," he said, nodding at the money in my fist, 5,000 Nigerian nairas that cracked like old bread when I counted it again. I remember the smell of damp floor, the crooked picture frame of a beach we had never visited, the way the curtain stuck to the window like it feared the night. He laughed, and I felt something close quietly inside me, the soft click of a door that would never open again. People say that love is a masquerade. When the drums stop, the spirit returns to the forest. Standing there with a small bag and a small sum and a heart that had learned to hold its own light, I knew the masquerade had ended. I stood on the edge of our tiny sitting room and listened to him tune his laughter like a radio until the station became clear. I did not cry. Tears are seeds. In the wrong soil, they feed only weeds. I tightened my grip on the bag, slipped on my flat shoes, and stepped into the rainy corridor that smelled of smoke, pepper, and goodbye. My shadow stretched in the corridor light like a thin path I had not noticed before. The street outside hissed with rain, a long, secret whisper passing from gutter to gutter as if the city were telling me to keep walking. Acacia on a wet night is a museum of small sorrows. A hawker guarding her tray with a nylon. A bus conductor snapping his fingers for passengers like a man catching dreams, the smell of suya struggling against damp charcoal. The taxis blinked in yellow patience, danfos wore their dents like medals, and I joined the line of people who moved like a single creature with many feet. The notes in my pocket felt both heavy and light, a stone wrapped in paper. "Cece, where you dey go?" a driver called. "Where the road is still honest," I wanted to say, but I said, "Under bridge," and climbed in. Water slithered into the bus through a crack in the window and traced a cold finger on my wrist. Beside me, a woman with tired eyes folded a newspaper into a pillow and closed the story of the day on her lap. I watched neon signs flicker and die, vendor umbrellas ripple, and puddles choose their own shapes. At the stop, I walked the narrow path to an all-night park where the air smelled of diesel and boiled corn, a place where every face wore the look of someone who had bargained with sleep and lost. A boy shouted destinations in a voice that had learned to carry farther than his body, and I held my bag closer, my future sitting small and stubborn inside it like a wrapped kola nut. I did a quiet accounting: 2 tops, 1 skirt, a cheap comb, toothpaste, a small notepad, pen, and that wad of notes. Not much, but a dowry of grit. Somewhere between the rain and the bus horns, the memory of Daniel's grin tried to return, but I refused it entry. Not every guest is meant for the living room. I stood under a tin awning, counted to 10, and chose the bus whose headlights did not tremble. Leaving is a kind of faith, and that night I practiced it one step at a time. The bus engine coughed awake like an old man clearing his throat to talk sense, and we rolled into the wet throat of the highway. Legos thinned behind us, its stubborn lights biting the dark, then surrendering one by one. I kept the notepad open on my knees, writing nothing, drawing a line that looked like a road and felt like a promise. The man across the aisle wore sleep like a borrowed coat. It did not quite fit him. A child 2 seats ahead hiccuped and then settled, the soft hiccup becoming a tiny metronome for my thoughts. I thought of the first time I met Daniel at a bookca near Maryland, how he had handed me a spoon and said the stew had a voice. He was all charm then, eyes bright as morning water, words slippery but sweet. Over time the sweetness gathered a crust. Pride sat in our house like an uninvited elder, taking the best chair. I remembered the afternoons when my ideas were dismissed with a shrug, when my attempts at saving small amounts were called villager behavior, when kindness was something he loved receiving but spent sparingly. The bus rocked like a cradle, but did not lull me. Rain tapped the roof in an even, tapping sermon, and I listened like a congregation of one. I traced the window with my finger, a map of places I had not seen, but needed to believe into being. Ibadan, the conductor called in the dark, tasting the name like cola nut, bitter first, then something else. I didn't know what waited there. That ignorance felt both like a scarecrow and a compass. It startled me, but it pointed too. I said a small prayer that felt more like breathing than begging, folded the notepad, and watched the road lift and fall like a chest remembering how to breathe after running. By the time we reached the city's edge and the signboard flashed through mist, Ibadan, dawn had not arrived, but the night had loosened its belt. The bus sighed to a stop, and the passengers spilled out like beans from a split sack, each person catching themselves and gathering what belonged to them. The air tasted different here, less salt, more rust, a quieter hunger. I stepped onto the ground and felt the weight of my choice press into my heels, not crushing, just insisting that I stand properly. The parquet challenge was waking up. Women adjusting headscarves with one hand and balancing their trays with the other. A man stirring a pot until steam found his face and blessed it. Traders calling prices like proverbs, short, sharp, tested by time. I found a bench near a flickering bulb and sat, the bag on my lap like a child that must not be dropped. I counted the notes again, not because they had multiplied, but because my fingers needed faith they could touch. 5,000 can be a door or a wall, depending on the hand that holds it. I told myself the old saying my grandmother used to murmur in Igbita when power went out and everyone waited for the generator man. Night has sighs, but morning has mouth. The morning would speak soon. For now, I must learn its grammar. A tout with a crescent scar on his cheek tried to sell me a seat to a place I did not know. I smiled and shook my head. Not every drumbeat is for your feet. I asked a woman where I could find a cheap room, and she pointed with her lips, the way women do when their hands are busy surviving. I rose and walked toward the street where the roofs rolled away like rusted waves, the city clearing its throat for another day, and I stepped into its voice, ready to listen, ready to begin again. The city did not welcome me with open arms. It measured me with narrow eyes and asked, without speaking, if I had the stamina to keep walking. Ibadan is an old city, and old cities have no patience for visitors who arrive with soft hands and restless hearts. Its streets were like the veins of a stubborn giant, some broad and lively, others thin and winding into places that looked like they had forgotten their own names. I wandered for the first few days with the kind of focus only desperation can give, looking for work the way a hunter scans the ground for faint prints. Lodging was another story. I found myself in a crowded house behind Dugby Market, where the air was always thick with the scent of fried akara, dust, and a faint sourness that came from too many feet using the same bathroom. The rent was low because the room had no window, and my half of it was separated from my roommates by nothing more than a hanging sheet that smelled faintly of bleach. Nights were filled with the distant bark of dogs, the clink of bottles from nearby beer parlors, and the shouts of lovers who forgot the thinness of the walls. There was no comfort here, but there was space enough to lie down and think without hearing Daniel's voice. In the mornings, I rose before the other tenants so I could claim the first bucket of clean water from the shared drum in the courtyard, because the later buckets often came with floating ants and tiny bits of leaves. My meals were whatever the market women could spare cheaply, boiled yam with palm oil, sometimes a small bag of groundnuts to last the afternoon. Money left my fingers as reluctantly as rain leaves the sky in December, but it left all the same. Each day, I walked farther into the heart of the city, mapping it not with pen or paper, but with the aches in my legs and the new calluses on my feet. Ibadan's buses had their own language, each conductor shouting not just the destination, but his own rhythm, as if to say that where you were going mattered less than how you announced it. I learned to move with the tide of people, not against it, and to carry my bag in front of me when the crowd pressed too close. It was in the middle of one of those slow days, with my sandals already thin from the friction of walking, that I met Tessie. She was leaning against the open doorway of a provision shop near Bear Roundabout, tapping her nails against a chilled bottle of malt, and watching the world pass, as if it were a parade arranged solely for her entertainment. Her round face was framed by tight braids, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone used to being listened to. She asked if I was looking for something specific, and I told her I was looking for everything: work, a place to stay that didn't smell like defeat, and maybe a reason to believe the journey here wasn't a mistake. She laughed, not unkindly, and offered me a seat on an empty crate by the doorway. Over the next hour, I learned that Tessie worked as a clerk in a mid-tier company in Makola, and lived in a small self-contained room not far from the shop. She didn't promise me miracles, only that she knew a few people, and that a room might soon be available in her building if I didn't mind sharing for a while. I didn't mind. In the way that strangers sometimes offer you a lifeline without realizing it, Tessie handed me a thread that I decided to follow. That evening she walked me to her compound, which was slightly better than the one I was in, still noisy, still narrow in the way city housing tends to be, but the walls were painted and the landlord's wife sold bread in the mornings. I moved in 2 days later with all my possessions fitting easily into one plastic bag, and for the first time since arriving in Ibadan, I felt the faint outlines of stability. Tessie had a way of making the cramped room feel like a safer space, even when the electricity failed and the fan's slow blades halted in the thick night air. She spoke of the city not as a monster to be feared, but as a creature with moods. You just had to learn how to approach it. I began my search for work again, this time with Tessie's advice tucked into my mind like a lucky charm. She told me to start with small things, to let my face become familiar in the places I visited. City people hire faces they've seen before, she said, sipping her tea one evening. I cleaned floors in a stationery store for 2 weeks before they let me also arrange shelves, which paid a little more. On alternate days, I helped a food seller wash plates and slice vegetables until my hands smelled permanently of onions. I learned to balance a tray of bottled drinks on one palm, to carry crates without hurting my back, and to bargain with customers who thought every price was an insult. On days when work was scarce, I joined Tessie in walking to Bodija Market to buy vegetables she would later resell in smaller quantities to neighbors. It wasn't glamour, it was grit dressed in plain clothes, and I wore it until it began to feel like part of me. I noticed that people remembered small acts, returning change promptly, greeting elders with a smile, offering to carry something heavy for a stranger. These tiny exchanges became invisible seeds I didn't realize I was planting. In the evenings, Tessie and I would sit outside on a wooden bench, watching the sky stain itself in orange and purple before night took over. She would talk about her office, and I would listen carefully, filing away details about the world beyond markets and street stalls. Her stories were like windows into rooms I hadn't yet entered. One Tuesday afternoon, when the sun was high enough to flatten shadows and make the tar smell sharp, Tessie mentioned that she had to deliver a document to her office before closing time. She asked if I wanted to walk with her, saying it would be a change from my usual rounds. I agreed without thinking much of it, not knowing that this small decision would crack open the wall I had been pushing against since I left Lagos. Her office building was on a quieter street in Makola, a place where the traffic sounded far away and the air smelled faintly of polish and paper. The security man at the gate greeted Tessie by name, and we stepped into a lobby with floors that shone so brightly I hesitated to walk across them in my worn sandals. While Tessie went upstairs, I waited near the reception, tracing the patterns in the tile with my eyes. That was when I noticed an older man struggling with a stack of thick files near the staircase. Without thinking, I crossed over and offered to help. He hesitated, then smiled and allowed me to take part of the load. His hands bore the marks of years of work, darkened knuckles, veins standing like roots under the skin, but his eyes were kind. We spoke briefly as we climbed the stairs, my voice low, his slower as though weighing each word. I didn't know who he was, and when I left that day, I thought it was nothing more than a brief act of courtesy. It would take weeks before I learned how wrong I was about that. Weeks stretched like rubber bands that refused to snap, and in their stretch I learned the long breath of patience, the sort that makes a person's bones hum with quiet work. After the day at Tessie's office, I returned to my routine of sweeping store aisles before sunrise, rinsing soap from buckets until my palms grew pale maps, and measuring hope in spoonfuls I could afford. I did not look for miracles. I kept my head low and my ears open, because in a city like Ibadan, news travels on the wings of casual chatter, and you have to catch it mid-flight. Tessie carried stories home like groceries, and I helped her unpack them. Who had resigned, who had been transferred, which company had posted a vacancy notice with requirements that read like wish lists. In the evenings, while the sky slowly removed its colors and the mosquitoes began their thin prattle, we shared bread and cheap tea and swapped lessons. She taught me how to knot a scarf so it sat like a crown rather than a bandage, how to stand in a queue without being swallowed by the bolder elbows of those who mistook impatience for importance, how to say good afternoon, in a way that made a receptionist raise her head. I, in turn, taught myself the small courage of stepping into places that smelled of polish and air conditioning without believing the floor would push me back. At a corner cybercafe near Orita, I practiced typing until the keys knew the rhythm of my fingers, and the attendant, who wore his cap backward as if he had turned his day around by force, showed me how to build a simple resume. He did not laugh when I wrote volunteer assistant for market inventory, even though he knew volunteer meant I had stood beside Tessie counting tomatoes at Bodija. He only asked questions and hit print with a flourish. When I slid the fresh paper into a nylon sleeve, I felt like I had bottled a sliver of sunlight. Days later, Tessie came home with eyes that flickered in that way hers did when she held a secret by its tail. An older man from her building, the one whose files I had carried, had asked for me by description, the way people ask for a song with just a hummed chorus. He had been visiting from Lagos, she said, a senior figure in a firm whose name sat on glossy signboards in Victoria Island, and whose deals occupied the pages of business sections like quiet thunder. He said you have a way of seeing what needs doing and doing it, Tessie reported, as if reciting a prophecy. I did not let my face betray the leap in my chest. In this life, you do not clap before the drummer raises his stick. The first phone call came on a Thursday morning, when light had barely knelt at the window. My number was printed on the resume, clumsy and hopeful, and when it rang I almost dropped the kettle I was lifting from the coal stove. The voice on the other end was warm and unhurried, vowels rounded by schooling and habit. He introduced himself as Kazim, and said he remembered the afternoon with the files because it is the small bridges that save you from big rivers. He asked about my availability, my comfort with schedules that stretched past daylight, my ability to learn as I worked. Each question was a gate. I knocked gently and passed through. He said his office in Lagos had an opening for a junior assistant, nothing fancy, no promises, but a doorway all the same if I was willing to climb its lintel. My heart beat like talking drums, messengers who cannot keep quiet. Traveling to Lagos would cost money and courage. One I could count, the other I had to borrow from faith. Tessie took my reluctance like an old shirt and folded it neatly. She said the road to a market is always longer the first time, and that I should think of Lagos not as a city with teeth, but as a table with many chairs. We spent the evening preparing the small things that make a big difference when the moment arrives, polishing my shoes until they reflected a gentle version of the world, stitching the loose hem of my plain blouse, trimming my nails so they looked intentional rather than neglected. At the tailor's stall beside the drainage, I traded a week's side earnings for a skirt that fell in a clean line, nothing loud, just correct. The next day we visited a photographer whose studio light turned faces into testimonies. He fussed over my posture and made me tilt my chin as if I already knew success by name. On Saturday, we counted out transport fare and tucked a little extra into my bag for emergencies because a stranger's city can swallow money like a greedy child eats sweet. I called my mother in Igbita and told her I might travel. She blessed me in sentences stitched with prayers and proverbs, reminding me that no path is truly new under the sun, only the feet are. In the small hours of Monday, while the compound snored, I packed my bag with the care of someone loading a fragile story. Resume, identification, a notebook, extra stockings, an old watch whose tick had grown faint but steady. I did not sleep much. Worry and excitement took turns like guards changing shift. Lagos received me with the broad shoulders of Third Mainland Bridge and the endless mouth of its traffic, shouting, laughing, grinding, living at a pitch that makes a person either shrink or enlarge. I refused to shrink. From the park at Ojota, I found a bus toward the island, my bag pressed to my lap, knuckles white with grip. The driver handled the steering as if the wheels were stubborn animals, coaxing, snapping, soothing, and I watched the skyline sharpen as we slipped past Ojalegba, Suralere, and onward where the air began to carry a different perfume: salt, glass, ambition. Victoria Island rose like a promise wrapped in glass, and for a moment I wondered if I had worn the wrong life for such a place. But I remembered Tessie's words: buildings cannot chew, only people can. The security men at the entrance of the tower eyed me professionally. Their gaze was not cruel, only measuring, as the city often is. I greeted first, clearly, and showed my letter, printed on paper that felt heavier than it looked. Inside, air conditioning hummed like a well-fed cat, and the floors had that night sky shine that makes a person watch their steps. I waited in reception where chairs swallowed you politely, and a digital screen drifted through slides of the company's achievements: acquisitions, partnerships, staff retreats at resorts with names that sounded like laughter. When the receptionist asked if I needed water, I said yes, because refusing kindness can be a kind of pride, and I had shed that skin. As I drank, I noticed the choreography of the place. Suits and heels tracing straight lines, doors closing with soft authority, elevator dinging like a bell that refused idle talk. When my name was called, my throat dried, then calmed, then remembered its job. I was led past glass-walled rooms where people spoke in low voices, their hands telling stories their mouths did not. A framed photograph on the wall showed a young team planting trees at a school in Aja. The caption used words like stewardship and legacy. I tucked away the observation that this company liked to be seen doing good, not for the sake of a mask, but because perception is currency here. Then we turned a corner, and there he was in a navy suit that made his eyes look like evening. Mr. Kazim, the man of the files, carrying no papers this time, only a smile that acknowledged the odd threads that tie moments together across cities. The interview did not feel like an interrogation under a bright light. It felt like walking along a riverbank with someone who has crossed it many times and wants to know if you can read currents. We sat in a room where one wall wore books instead of paint, and he began not with qualifications, but with a memory of Abaddon's rainfall, how it teaches roofs discipline. I told him about markets before dawn, about counting change while the power blinked, about learning to arrive early because lateness is a debt that drags interest. He asked for specifics the way a careful cook asks for measurements, and I offered the small precise things that show a habit rather than a performance. How I arranged inventory by expiry instead of color because the eye can be seduced but time cannot. How I noticed that customers surrender faster when you place the pen in their hand rather than pointing at it across the counter. How a manager's day loosens if you anticipate the second thing he will need before he finishes the first. He nodded sometimes, refused to nod at others, waiting to see if I would fill the silence with fumes or with substance. When he asked why I had left Lagos for Abaddon, I did not mention Daniel by name because this was not a courtroom, and bitterness is a perfume that announces lack. I said simply that I needed to learn my own weight without familiar hands pressing down on the scale. He smiled with his eyes, then returned to schedules, deadlines, discretion. At one point he stepped out, and a woman with a tidy bun slid into the seat he had left warm. She introduced herself as head of administration, and asked if I could be trusted with simple secrets that are not simple at all, salaries, calendars, corridor gossip that could dent reputations if mishandled. I said trust is built like a compound wall, block by block, and if a person throws one careless sentence into the mix, the wall might stand today, but it will crumble when the heavy rain comes. She did not smile, but something in her gaze softened, as if a knot had loosed. When Kazim returned, he thanked me for coming, said the company would consider and reach out, said the usual polite things with a tone that did not feel like dismissal. As I stood to leave, he added, in a quiet voice that made the air lean in, that sometimes doorways test your height, but open wider when you walk toward them without hunching. Outside, the afternoon light lay across the floor like fabric, and I walked through it slowly, feeling the seam of one life tug while the hem of another began, very gently, to be stitched. The message came on a damp Thursday morning, the kind where Lagos clouds hang heavy like curtains not yet drawn, muting both light and sound. I had been back in Abaddon for just 3 days, my mind still pacing the corridors of that glass-walled office in Victoria Island, when Tessie's phone lit up with my name. She answered in the half-playful tone she reserved for when she had news, then handed the device to me without explanation. It was Mr. Kazim's voice again, calm but carrying a thread of urgency. The company had reviewed the interviews, and they wanted me to start the following Monday. It's probation, of course, he added, as though reminding me that open doors still expect you to knock before entering. I sat for a long moment with the phone pressed to my ear, even after the line went silent, letting the words sink past the noise of the street outside. Tessie laughed, clapped her hands, and began an inventory of what I would need for Lagos living. More than 2 work blouses, a bag that didn't sag at the corners, shoes that could hold their dignity against both rain and corporate tiles. That weekend, I packed the essentials with the care of someone choosing the stones to build a new house. My fare was counted into an envelope. My mother's voice came through the phone again, this time heavy with both pride and caution, telling me that new waters are not always clear, so I must learn to feel the current with my feet before I drink. The Monday sun was only a pale idea when I boarded the bus for Lagos. At Ojota, I navigated the human river of traders, hawkers, and commuters until I reached the smaller buses that fed into the island's business districts. By the time I stood before the reception desk again, the air conditioning had banished the heat from my skin, but not the tremor from my hands. I signed a visitor log that now bore my name in a new column, Staff Onboarding, and was shown to a modest desk near the back of an open-plan office where screens flickered like restless windows. My job was simple in its outline: manage schedules, prepare meeting rooms, track documents, and anticipate the needs of those too busy to articulate them. But simplicity in a place like this is a river with hidden depths, and I learned quickly that missing one small detail could ripple into a day's worth of trouble. The first weeks were a slow apprenticeship in reading the unspoken language of the office. Here, silence could mean efficiency or tension, depending on how the papers moved across a desk. A raised eyebrow from a department head could signal either a request or a warning, and it was my job to know which. I kept my ears open for the footstep patterns of my superiors, the way some hurried when pressed for time while others slowed down as if to stretch the day. I noticed who preferred their tea before a meeting, and who would not touch food until every item on an agenda was crossed off. I wrote everything in a small notebook I kept hidden in the drawer: names, preferences, small tells that could help me stay 2 steps ahead. My days started earlier than the office clock and ended only when the last light dimmed from the glass boardrooms. In those quiet minutes after most had left, I would review my tasks, set the following day's folders in order, and wipe the desk until it looked like a blank page again. My clothes, though still modest, began to change in their posture. A well-pressed shirt gains its own kind of authority, and even shoes remember to stand taller when polished. There was no grand announcement of my competence, but I saw it in the way requests became more precise when addressed to me, in the trust given without fanfare. Mr. Kazim would occasionally stop by my desk, dropping a comment or question that seemed casual, but was in fact a quiet measure of how I handled pressure. Each time I responded with clarity, he would nod in that small way that told me the bridge between us was holding. Outside the office, I learned the rhythm of Lagos commuting, the patience it demanded when traffic turned the roads into long sighs of metal and horn. I began to eat lunch at the same small bukka in a back street where the stew tasted of both pepper and comfort, and where the owner soon started greeting me by name. The city was slowly, reluctantly making space for me. By the third month, my responsibilities had grown, though the title remained the same. I was asked to coordinate small internal events, training sessions, departmental briefings, even the occasional client visit. This meant juggling details that lived in different worlds. Booking a projector while ensuring the snacks arrived at the same time as the marketing team, confirming attendance without turning the reminder emails into clutter. I learned the delicate art of chasing approvals without seeming impatient, of rephrasing the same request in ways that nudged instead of pushed. It was during one such client meeting that I caught my first glimpse of the scale at which this company operated. Numbers were discussed that made my mind stretch to imagine their weight. Partnerships were spoken of in terms that felt like maps being drawn in midair. I poured water into glasses and arranged notepads without being noticed, yet I heard everything. After the meeting, the head of a department paused by my desk and said, "You have an ear for the room." I took it as the compliment it was, knowing that in places like this, listening well was a currency that could buy doors. Gradually, I began to understand that my role was not just to follow instructions, but to anticipate needs before they became spoken words. If a meeting was called for 4 o'clock, I knew to have the room ready by 3:30, the documents placed in a neat stack, the projector tested twice. If someone returned from a tense phone call, I made sure their next appointment was spaced with enough time to breathe. These were small acts, but they were the scaffolding of trust. On Fridays, when the air in the office loosened slightly, I would hear laughter drifting from the break room, and sometimes I joined, careful to stay at the edge where conversation did not require my opinion but appreciated my presence. In this way, I built my place here quietly, steadily, like water finding its path through stone. By the 6th month, the shift was no longer subtle. My name began appearing on internal emails that carried weight, invitations to meetings where decisions were shaped rather than merely reported. When the head of administration went on leave, I was asked to stand in for certain tasks, a test disguised as an opportunity. It was during this period that I realized how far I had traveled from the woman who had once stood outside in the rain clutching a small bag and a smaller sum. I handled vendor negotiations, approved minor expenses, even coordinated between departments on sensitive deadlines. My desk was now the place people stopped by when they needed both an answer and discretion. Outside work, I had moved into a small but private room closer to the office, its single window framing the city's restless lights. The walk from my building to the main road took me past a seamstress who always waved her tape measure in greeting, a fruit seller who kept the best mangoes under the table until I passed, and the night guard who saluted me half-jokingly. There was a rhythm now, a thread of belonging stitched through my days. One evening, as I locked up after the last meeting, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the boardroom. The clothes were different, the posture straighter, but it was the eyes that held me, the quiet steadiness in them, the absence of that old weight. I realized that without fanfare or applause, I had crossed a threshold. The laughter that had once trailed me like a shadow was now far behind, and ahead lay a road I was not afraid to walk, no matter where it bent. The city's pulse slowed only on paper. In real life it beat harder when decisions ripened, and the week after the vendor meeting was one of those weeks when even the photocopier sounded like it was thinking. I built my report like a careful house, foundation of numbers, walls of timelines, roof of risk. Procurement fed me what they'd gathered, quotes from competitors across Lagos and Port Harcourt, shipping estimates from a papa that read like weather forecasts, and a neat table of exchange rate sensitivity that made our finance lead sigh. I added what I'd observed in the room, the way their answers leaned on fog when they needed bone, the unanchored promise of relationships, the vague cousin smell clinging to their Port Harcourt supplier. I called each reference they'd sent after hours, and the first two numbers rang into tomorrow without greeting. The third answered on a voice note that said, "Who be this?" before hanging up. I wrote that down too. Meanwhile, the office kept turning its wheels. A legal review here, a marketing brief there, the CEO's calendar shifting like a cautious dancer. Mr. Kazim passed my desk with a question concealed as a greeting, and I nodded in a way that meant the stew was on fire but not burning. That evening, just as I was ready to slip my notebook into my bag, my phone lit with an unknown number, and something in the digits felt like déjà vu. The voice that arrived was smaller than the man who owned it, measuring instead of declaring. He said he wanted to thank me for a fair hearing, and wondered if we could speak somewhere less formal. 5 minutes only. A coffee place on Ozumbambadu where the noise would be polite and the chairs forgiving. I agreed because I had nothing to hide, and because courage is not always volume. Sometimes it is simply showing up with your back straight. Tessie called just then, and when I told her, she went quiet on the line, then said to wear calm the way one wears perfume, lightly but let it arrive before you do. I ironed my blouse that night until the fabric understood posture, slept in slices, and woke before my alarm, Lagos already muttering outside like a neighbor who never went to bed. The cafe had glass that reflected the lagoon like a distracted mirror, and the barista pulled espresso with the focus of a surgeon. He was there before me, not alone, but with his silence wound tight around him. He stood as I approached, that old instinct for charm rising and falling like a fish at the surface. We sat at a corner table, where the music was a hum rather than a song, and for a moment I watched him rehearse courage with his hands. He began with weather words, traffic, heat, the city's appetite, but they fidgeted and fell off the table. Then he said my name, slowly, not as if he owned it, but like he was borrowing it for a fragile errand. I was a fool, he said, and the sentence took effort, as if he were pushing it through a narrow place. He lined up his reasons, not excuses, he insisted, cash flow gaps during a bad quarter, a shipment drowned in one's paperwork, a partner who took a cut too large to survive, pride that made him decorate failure until it looked like a guest of honor, and then wouldn't leave. He said the deal would save jobs, not his ego. 3 staff in Suralere who believed their December salary could still appear, one in Acadia whose wife had a baby on the way. He said the references were real men with real names, but 2 had traveled and their phones were like goats, stubborn unless you shook the rope. I listened and thought of a proverb my grandmother saved for stubborn knees. When a floor is slippery, it is not the time to dance new steps. He asked if there was a way to stagger the deliveries, to structure the contract like a ladder he could climb instead of a wall he must fly over. In that moment, I faced the tug of war between the woman who remembered rain on zinc and the one who now polished boardroom tables until they reflected faces back at their owners. Kindness is not a ladder you hand to a man building a tree house in a storm. Sometimes it is a map of safe roads and a warning about gullies. I said we valued capacity demonstrated under pressure, not just under promise, and that a smaller pilot might be the bridge he needed. His eyes found relief and shame in the same blink. He held his cup like a prayer bowl, and for a heartbeat I recalled the smell of our old living room and a laugh that thought it could chase me forever. I set my cup down and let the porcelain meet the saucer with a soft, decisive click. Back at the office, due diligence gathered teeth. Compliance sent a polite bomb. The tax clearance certificate submitted with the bid bore a watermark slightly crooked, an error unlikely in official print. Legal called their contact at first to confirm. The stamp number lived a double life, attached to a document lodged months earlier by a different outfit. In another corner, a junior analyst found a paragraph in their company profile that matched a competitor's brochure word for word, even the typo in warehaju. I compiled it all without salt, just facts, though facts sometimes sting more than pepper. The twist arrived as I stitched the report together. One of the bank statements they offered had a ledger line that sang a familiar name, an account held at a microfinance firm in Yaba, whose director's surname matched Mr. Kazim's, not a common one. My stomach dropped and then settled. Lagos is a small big town, and coincidence is a regular customer. I walked my feet to Kazim's office with the care of someone carrying a candle through wind. He stood by the window, looking at traffic as if it were a beaded curtain he could part with a hand. I placed the folder on his desk and showed him the line. He looked once, then twice, then exhaled. The director was his cousin, he said, a man he hadn't spoken to in a year after a family quarrel that began at a burial and refused to be buried. He thanked me for catching it because perception is not a soft thing here. It is glass. He then picked up the phone and placed a call I will never forget. Not to procurement, not to legal, but to his cousin, voice neutral, words clean. He ended it with, "We cannot be in the same sentence on paper." After, he turned to me and said this would complicate, but not cloud. My report went forward with an addendum. Potential related party perception flagged. Independent verification recommended. References pending. That afternoon, Daniel arrived at reception with an envelope and a look like a man trying to carry two goats at once, pride and need. He asked to see me. I asked him to submit through the front desk. He stood there, a former life and a recent pitch sharing a jacket, and the receptionist raised her brow in my direction. I shook my head. Rules are not a knife for other people's cake. You must eat your slice by them too. He left the envelope with the proper tag and walked out slowly, a man counting steps like money. I took the package, signed the log, and returned to my desk to find an email from compliance asking me to schedule a final review with a single sentence that felt like a gavel. Prepare the recommendation. I wrote the recommendation as daylight, tilted into that softer hour when even Lagos sighs. I used the company's language because it is a fence that keeps feelings from trampling facts. Capacity risk high given unverified references, documentation inconsistencies unresolved, pricing above benchmark without clear justification, related party optics requiring remedial fire breaks. Yet I left a door not open but visible. Consideration for a limited pilot on non-critical items, subject to escrow terms and daily performance reporting, could be explored after compliance clears updated documents. I sent it to the team, copied where necessary, and closed my eyes before hitting submit. Not in prayer but in the way swimmers close their eyes before a dive, trusting the body will remember. Moments later, the elevator dinged and out stepped an errand I had not scheduled. Daniel again, this time requested upstairs by procurement for clarifications. He paused when he saw me by the corridor printer, and for a flash the years collapsed and rebuilt themselves. The man in front of me was neither villain nor victim, but a human being standing where choices ripen. He said, "Whatever you decide, decide clean," and for the first time he sounded like someone who had learned the texture of consequences. The meeting upstairs outlasted sunset, and when the doors eventually spilled him toward the lobby, his shoulders had the slope of a traveler who had discovered the road did not end where he hoped. He walked to the glass, looked at the lagoon now stitched with office lights, and then turned. He did not beg. He did not accuse. He nodded, a small bow to a version of me he had never imagined meeting in a room like this. I returned to my desk and found the final note from legal. Recommendation accepted. The subject line felt both heavy and clean. I filed the papers, shut down the computer, and stood a while with my hands on the back of my chair. Outside, the night vendors called in voices that threaded through exhaust and laughter, and my reflection hovered in the glass like a quiet witness. The past had tried to knock in the language of urgency. I had replied in the dialect of structure. On my way down, the security man at the door lifted two fingers in a salute that made me smile. The rain started, soft needles stitching earth to sky, and I stepped into it without flinching, because finally it was just weather again, not a memory trying to wear me. The week after the board approved the recommendation, the air in the office settled into its familiar rhythm. but something inside me had shifted, as if a door once jammed by old furniture had finally swung freely on its hinges. Mornings began earlier, not out of anxiety, but because I liked to watch the light lift itself along the lagoon, a pale strip that gathered courage as the day grew teeth. My new desk faced the windows, and I found that Lagos looked gentler from this angle. Traffic as a patient braid, rooftops breathing under small winds, the water carrying small boats like stubborn thoughts that refused to drown. Tasks arrived in steady lines, a rollout plan that required coordinating 5 departments, a vendor audit that demanded clear eyes and a steady pen, a staff mentorship circle that I hadn't asked for, but that found me anyway. I said yes to the circle because someone once said yes to a girl who carried a stranger's files up a flight of stairs, and debts like that should be paid back in kind rather than cash. At home, the room had learned my habits. Shoes in a disciplined row, work blouses resting like quiet soldiers, a bowl on the windowsill where spare coins and small intentions collected. On Sundays I called my mother from the same spot on the balcony where the network behaved, and she listened as if each update were rain on dry ground. Sometimes, when the evening pressed its ear against the city and listened to our lives, I would remember the way Daniel's shoulders sloped as the elevator doors closed, and the memory felt neither sharp nor soft, just factual, like an old mark on a doorframe that proves a person has grown. There was no victory dance inside me, only a calm arrangement of truths. I had walked away with 5,000 naira and a bag of ordinary things. I had learned that professionalism can be a blade that cuts free without spilling blood. I had found a way to keep my hands clean while my work did the speaking. Toward the end of the quarter, the company hosted a small stakeholder breakfast at a hotel in Ikoyi, all white tablecloths and coffee that smelled like attention. I arrived early to check the seating plan, to test the handheld mics, to ensure the projector wouldn't decide to stutter at the first slide like a nervous singer. Guests arrived in waves, bankers with folded newspapers, supply partners with crisp smiles, a journalist whose eyes took notes while his hands relaxed. The CEO opened with a story about patience disguised as discipline, and I watched the room lean forward the way a classroom leans when a teacher swaps formulas for memory. Midway through, a question about vendor gatekeeping surfaced, and it would have been easy for the answer to turn defensive. Instead, our operations lead spoke about integrity, like it was a bridge everybody had to cross without shaking it. I felt my name brush the edge of the conversation, and then move on, unspoken but present in the way processes were framed. Afterward in the corridor, an older woman stopped me to ask if I was the one who kept the little things from falling between cracks. And I said maybe, because credit is a shy animal and must be approached without sudden movements. On my lunch break, I took a short walk along the hotel's quiet edge, where bougainvillea climbed old walls, and the air held the salt of distant water. My phone buzzed again, a message from an unknown number. We tightened our documentation. Thank you for making me see where it counted. No name, but I didn't need one. I tucked the phone away and let the afternoon keep its shape. When the event closed, I gathered stray name tags, straightened the chairs, and pressed my palms briefly against the cool, blank table, an old habit that felt like signing my name without ink. Back at my desk, I drafted a note to the team praising the quiet efficiencies that had made the morning seamless. Praise, I'd learned, feeds the right fires and keeps people warm in rooms where the air is often cold. The last time the story tried to circle back with drama, it failed politely. A month later, moving between meetings, I saw Daniel again, this time at a municipal building near Marina, arguing softly with a clerk about a permit date. His voice never rose. He listened, corrected, adjusted. Then he stepped aside to make a call and returned with a document the clerk accepted without fuss. Efficiency had replaced bravado, and it made him look taller than all the swagger ever did. He glanced up, recognized me, and gave a brief nod that asked nothing, offered nothing, only acknowledged a fellow traveler on the city's crowded footpaths. It felt right. That evening, I returned home to find a small package at my door, a modest fountain pen wrapped in brown paper, no note, just my name in tidy handwriting. I turned it over in my hands and decided to let it be a symbol without searching too hard for the sender, a tool for signatures that promised steadier lines. I filled a page in my notebook, testing the ink, writing down a plan to visit my mother, to buy Tessie a new headscarf from Balagan Market, to save toward a course on operations that I had been eyeing but postponing. The rain began, not as memory but as weather, tapping the roof in a pattern that asked nothing of me except attention. I brewed tea, opened the window an inch, and let the city breathe into the room. Somewhere in Ikoyi, a generator coughed to life. Somewhere in Surulere, a football cheer lifted. Somewhere in Ibadan, Tessie laughed and made a small room feel large. I closed the notebook and leaned back, the pen warm between my fingers. The unsettling part of my story had ended without spectacle, the way a storm sometimes wanders off mid-sentence. What remained was the road ahead, long, bendy, honest, and the steady promise that I now knew how to walk it without waiting for anyone's laughter to tell me whether I could. Life will sometimes test you in ways that feel unfair, and people may underestimate the strength you carry. But never forget, storms don't last forever, and the rain that tried to drown you today can be the same rain that waters your tomorrow. Walk with dignity, guard your peace, and let your growth be the loudest answer to those who once doubted you. May your hands never lack honest work. May your feet always find the road that leads to peace. May your name be spoken in rooms where blessings are decided. And may every laughter meant to mock you turn into applause for your victories. May your days be full of strength, your nights full of rest. And may every closed door open in its right time, wide enough for you to walk through without bending. If you believe this, say a big, joyful amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.